on me. Use my iPad instead. Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Let me check real quick. Whoa. Just on the Facebook app here. Make sure that we're sounding good, and we're going to get off and running because I'm late. I'm sorry I'm late. I had some work stuff to do. I hope you can hear me. Let me check real quick. Cool. So it's coming through. Just on the Facebook app here. Make sure that we're sounding good, and we're going to get off. Coming through. Not super great connection today, but as per usual, y'all. If it drops out and you can't hear anything or you can't see anything, check out the YouTube link. I'll be saving this video on my computer and then uploading to YouTube. So if anything's not working, you can do it that way. Hello. Hello, everyone. Let's get to it, shall we? We're doing chapters 37 and 38 today. Again, if you're just tuning in randomly because you saw this pop up and you want to check out the rest of the whole book, click the YouTube link. I've got all of the chapters that I've read up to this point that are on there so you don't miss anything. Or you're welcome to just dive into the story. We're getting towards the end here, so things are getting exciting. Let's see, where do we leave off? Right, yes. So the authorities showed up, and they're kind of, they're grabbing everybody, arresting everybody, essentially, on Liberatia, and our group of friends just took the tram thing to trying to get back to the Red Robert, and heck, the guy that tried to take Susie, he has showed up again. And he's got a bunch of people with weapons. And he told them to put their hands up and said they've got nowhere to run. And that's where we left off. Let me take a really quick sip of some water here. And let's get rocking and rolling, shall we? Chapter 37. Heck had them outnumbered and surrounded. "No shiny robot to protect you this time," Heck said, rubbing his wrists where Colossus had suspended him back in the marketplace. He pointed up to the wanted posters. "Your friends are going to make me much more than I thought they were." Balta side-eyed the children, and Haber signaling for them to stay where they were. Brap, brap! 2 charges went off from Heck's weapon and exploded a shower of sparks from the top of the station platform. All 3 of the children flinched. "I said hands up," Heck said. He waggled his gun upward to punctuate the command. "And come on out of that tram car." Again, Balta side-eyed the children, and again, Petrick had the distinct impression the look meant they should stay where they were. Okay, Balta called out to their captor. "Just don't—" Brap, 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 brap! From her undercoat, Balta had pulled out 2 large golden guns and blasted off 5 shots in the vicinity of Heck and his goons before any of them had time to react. At first, Petrick thought that Balta had terrible aim. Not a single shot had actually hit any of them. But what Balta did next convinced him otherwise. With the hand nearest the sliding carriage door, gun and all, Balta slapped the control there. The door shut, just as Heck and his men were reacting. But not only was there now a physical barrier protecting their would-be prisoners, clouds of steam were billowing out from a series of pipes that Balta's golden guns had shot holes into. A second later, and Petrick couldn't even see 2 feet beyond the transparent doors. Shots rang out wildly in their direction, but the carriage jolted forward and whisked them away from danger. "You knew they were going to be there," Petrick said, turning to Balta. "I thought it was likely," she admitted. "I saw what I thought was one of his men watching us back at the station by Kronos's." "I'd have preferred you shared that information with us before putting us all in danger," Haber said. "And have these give away that I was onto them?" Balta pointed at the children. "No way. It was only the fact that they thought they'd surprised us that let me surprise them, okay? Hey, can we pretend to be surprised? Hey, we can pretend to be just as..." Sorry, let me read this again. "Hey, we can pretend to be surprised just as good as you, Squinty," Susie said. "Wait, where are we going?" Petrick interjected, gesturing to the carriage, which was taking them further into the Liberatia side of the station. "This tram's next stop," Balta answered. "Okay, and where is that?" I'm not really sure. I was hoping we'd have beaten Heck to the usual stop. That's the only one I've ever used." "Great," said Barry. "I'm telling you, we do not want to go through the market." Balta jabbed an open hand up at yet another grimy, flickering screen in yet another dark and dingy corridor that was showing their wanted posters from the authority. There was more low rumbling and shaking of the station. They'd been happening every couple minutes or so. It indicated to Petrick that the battle was intensifying somewhere out there beyond these walls. "We have to stick to the outer corridors," Balta said, a phrase she'd been repeating now for quite some time as they wandered through the back ways of the station. "But we know how to get to the ship from the marketplace," Susie insisted. She pointed to a crudely scrawled sign on the same wall with the wanted posters. "And the marketplace is that way." Petrick entered the fray. "We can't be seen. Let's trust the captain." "But she's lost." "I am not," Balta said. They came to an intersection of corridors that gave them the choice of right or a left. "Oh yeah? Which way then?" Susie said. Balta hesitated. The station rumbled again. "Captain, if I may," Haber said, "while I agree we should try as much as possible not to be seen, the longer we take to reach the Red Robert, the greater the chance the authority—" "Oh, be quiet, all of you," Balta said with a wave. "We want to go this way." She took them to the right. "I think." They walked a short distance and came to another intersection, this one a T situated in the middle of a long, straight corridor. "See?" Balta said. Down to the right, there was a round window that opened up to space. Down to the left, clearly, was the marketplace, bright and busy. It was a bit unnerving to be so close to all that hustle and bustle, but they finally had reached the outer edge of the station. Balta took off down to the right, toward the window. "Come on," she called to her charges. "The android is right. We need to hurry." The window at the end of the corridor was actually the elbow of a turn in the hallway, which then curved gently along the gate side edge of the station. They stopped briefly at the window, and Balta peered outside to get her bearings. "I know my way from here," she said. There was undeniable relief flooding into her voice. She had been lost. Outside the window, a battle was raging. The shuddering of the station was more intense here. Flashes of orange, red, green, and white light preceded it. "Our docking bay is just—" Balta trailed off. Someone was coming toward them down the long, curving corridor. 4 someones, it was revealed as they came closer. They were running. Our group was so exposed out in the open that there was nowhere to duck or hide, so they stood there. It was a foursome of men, tall, all dressed in dirty grays and browns. Their clothing was initially a relief to Petrick, since he doubted that authority troops would appear so shabby. Balta's words earlier, however, about all of Liberatia now being a liability, rang in his ears. The foursome beelined right toward them, and the one in the lead raised something in his hands. It was a weapon. Haber instinctively huddled the children closer to him. Balta pulled out her 2 golden guns at her sides, tense. "They're coming!" the lead of the foursome said. "Right behind us!" The men were upon them now, and all their weapons were out, but they had no eyes for our group. It was now that Petrick saw they were glancing behind them, over and over. They were being chased. The foursome of tall men swept past and disappeared in the direction where our group had just come from. Ahead, down the long, curving corridor, they could hear faint sounds of gunfire and see flashes of light, getting closer. "Damn," Balta said. She looked out at the fighting ahead of them, and then back at the other long corridor behind them that ran toward the marketplace. "The authority is between the Red Robert and us," Haber deduced. Balta nodded in the affirmative. "We're going to have to go through the market." Susie bit her tongue and shook her head, but she didn't say anything. They turned, and Balta led them, reluctantly, back down the corridor for the open entrance to the bright marketplace. The cacophony of activity buffeted them from all sides, and once they reached the entrance, they paused and instinctively shielded themselves. On the ceiling of the chamber were their pictures, staring back down at them. "Wanted." Each image had to be at least 100 feet tall. Barry groaned as he looked at them. "The captain was right. How is this ever going to work?" he said. There was a pause before Balta answered. "Just keep your heads down, and let's move quickly." The sea of people ahead of them was tossing and turning like a storm. Petrick wasn't sure quickly was going to be possible, but Susie grabbed his hand and plunged in first, and everyone followed. They bobbed and weaved their way through shopkeepers, desperately collecting their wares into bags, rolling carts, and even their clothing. Opportune thieves were running this way and that, snatching what they could, whether people were watching or not. People yelled, a gun was fired somewhere nearby, and our group instinctively ducked, looking for the source, which was nowhere to be found. It was chaos. Until a voice rang out. "Hey!" it said. "Hey!" It was a woman. Her face was wide with recognition, her hand-woven hat askew on the top of her head, her clothes covered in grime. She was pointing a shaking finger at Petrick. "You're—" she said, and then looked up at the ceiling above them, where Petrick's giant image glowed alongside the others. Another person stopped nearby, and then another. "Yeah," said a man with a child at his side, clinging to his leg. The man pointed up to the ceiling. Two more people stopped around them. "We have to keep going," Balta hissed. Our group began to back away from the small crowd that was forming, and bumped into another small group that was developing from behind. "Captain?" Haber said. They were becoming surrounded. The crowd was growing and started to press in around them. "Stay back!" Balta shouted. "Let us pass!" They were silent. In the air among the crowd, Petrick could feel the people asking themselves a question, standing on the edge of a cliff and considering whether it was worth jumping, worth selling their soul to the authority. "Let us pass!" Balta repeated, holding her hands up to the crowd. "They only want them!" someone said in the crowd. It was impossible to tell who. "Yeah!" said someone else from the opposite direction. The crowd had grown amid the rest of the chaos. It pressed 10 bodies or so deep, and someone shoved Haber. He was the tallest, the easiest target. He didn't fall. "You should shoot them," Susie whispered to Balta. "Too many," Balta replied. To the crowd, she raised her voice. "Let us leave here," she said. "We're not who they say we are." "You're a traitor!" another voice rang out. It sounded familiar. Petrick craned to see, but it was Haber, with his height, who first saw him. "It's Heck," he said, "and he's talking into some sort of small cylinder device." "It's a transmitter," Balta breathed. "He's calling the authority." Balta pointed a finger straight at the snake of a man and raised her voice yet again to the crowd. "He's the traitor!" she yelled. It was a well-timed gesture because Heck was bent over into his small transmitter just as the words were flung in his direction. The crowd turned, and Heck reacted with impulsive guilt. "He's leading the authority here!" Balta yelled. "Right now!" On cue, there was a loud banging sound from the far end of the marketplace where they'd been heading. A stream of armor-clad bodies rushed into the cavernous room. They were shiny black, gray, and white, covered from head to toe. Their weapons were drawn. From their midst, an imposingly tall figure in striking red stepped into view, a hand up. A panicked hush fell over the entire room as 3,000 fugitives watched the soldiers pour in and take their positions. "Remain where you are," the figure in red said, somehow amplifying its voice across the entire market. It was booming, full, and vaguely female. It hurt Clark's ears. "We're looking for the fugitives." Petrick could feel 1,000 eyes on him and his friends. "Do not resist." "Not bloody likely," Petrick heard Balta mutter. Her golden pistols were in her hands. She tapped Haber on the shoulder and shoved one of them into his hand. "Watch our tail, android," she said. She clicked over a cylinder that sat above the trigger and raised the gleaming pistol up toward the ceiling. "Never defeated!" she yelled as loudly as she possibly could. It was doubtful that the crowd much further than... Sorry, let me read that again. It was doubtful that the crowd much further than 300 feet or so from them could hear the rebel call, but everyone could hear what happened next. Balta fired 2 quick blasts up toward the ceiling of the market. They struck straight in the middle of the giant Petric image, which burst into sparks and flames. Balta had hit the holographic emitter. That emitter must have been connected in a power chain to the emitters for the other holographic pictures, because they too disappeared in sequenced bursts of fire. The sparks and flames then started to fall down onto the marketplace, almost in slow motion, fluttering in every direction. The reaction from the crowd was immediate. Weapons fire erupted from a dozen directions, aimed squarely at the authority troops, who likewise reacted instantly. Nobody had been fooled by the promises of peace. This was exactly what they'd been prepared for. Petrick felt the tug of Barry's hand in the melee. He tore his eyes from the firefight to see that Balta was charging her way through the crowd, away from the fight, away from Heck, and back toward the entrance they'd first emerged from. "Don't let go of me," Barry pleaded to Petrick. Petrick nodded and then ran. Haber brought up the rear, keeping a close eye on Heck, who was red-faced but falling behind them as the crowd swarmed in every direction. Some were running toward the fight, others away from it, all in the shower of sparks from the exploded hollow projection system above them. Balta's distraction had proved incredible. "Did you know that entire thing was going to explode?" Susie called up to her as they reached the edge of the market. "Nope," Balta heaved, putting a hand up to pause the group as they stepped back into the corridor. "I was just aiming for the ceiling." The corridor ahead of them was empty, with the window at the edge of the station far, far ahead. "Come on," Balta said. "We've got to get back to that window." She set off running again, sweating as she was. They were about halfway down when shouts from ahead of them stopped the group in their tracks. They strained to listen. "Authority troops," confirmed Haber, and he tapped his artificial ears to indicate that he could hear them. Petrick looked back behind them. The marketplace was a flashing chaos. No Heck yet, but he'd seen them escape into this very corridor. There was nowhere to run. "We're blocked," Haber said, stating the obvious. Balta was frozen in place, looking back and forth in either direction. "We're screwed." "Then we have to hide," said Susie. "Where?" said Barry. "There's nowhere," Balta said. "Unless you know a way to make us just disappear, we're screwed." She raised her weapon and set her jaw. An idea leaped into Petrick's mind. "Ah!" he said aloud. But as quickly as the idea came, it was squashed when he glanced at Haber and realized the android had left something behind in Kronos' chamber. "Oh, crunch," he said. "What?" Susie prodded him. She looked at him eagerly, desperately hoping he had a way out for them, but Petrick knew he didn't. "You left the pack of my dad's things back there," he said to Haber, figuring he might as well make sure. "Didn't you? On Balta's ore cart?" Haber's eyes widened with recognition, and then sagged and nodded. "I'm afraid that's correct," he said. Barry piped up. "Why do you want it?" His voice sounded funny. "We could use the atomizer," Petrick said, "but it's no use." Barry cleared his throat, and everyone now turned to look at him. Somewhat sheepishly, he swung his backpack around to his chest and untied it. Inside, clinking about, was a rather large pile Petrick instantly recognized as various handheld inventions that had been in Haber's pack. "I thought they might come in handy," Barry said. Susie flung her arms around him and squeezed. "Barry," she said, "you wonderful pack rat." Then she socked him in the shoulder. "And that's for stealing," she said. Barry didn't complain. He simply thrust the pile at Petrick. "Is one of these things the Amazoner?" It was sitting nearly on top, and Petrick reached for it just as they heard a shout from around the corner of the long hallway. The intruders were almost on top of them now, moments away. "Huddle up," he said to the group with as much of an urgent whisper as he could muster. The group obeyed, even Balta, who kept her mouth shut. What else was there to try? Petrick, in the center of the huddle, worked furiously with the small device, adjusting dials on its sides and flipping a series of switches. The voices from down the hallway seemed like they were right on top of them. They must have been just about to round the corner. "Petrick!" Haber hissed. There was a snap crackle, and then there were troops rounding the corner, backlit by the flashing lights that could be seen beyond the window. They were authority, no doubt. Their head-to-toe armor glistened ominously. Beside Petrick, Balta began to rise with her gun, ready to fight to the end. "What are you doing?" Petrick whispered through his teeth. Balta looked at him, confused, but she'd stopped moving. Petrick motioned her back down with the rest of the group. After a moment, as the troops continued their purposeful march toward them, he realized that none of them had trained their weapons on them. "Have," Balta breathed, "or we—" Petrick, by way of answering, took his hand and moved it toward the corridor wall behind them. He looked each of the rest of the group in the eye and then passed his hand right through the wall. "My stars," Balta said in a whisper. "They can't see us." "We're slightly out of atomic phase," Petrick said, eminently proud of himself. "Even light passes right through us." "Will they pass right through us?" asked Barry, who was looking at the oncoming troops. Oncoming as in coming directly at them. Petrick paused. He hadn't considered that. What would happen if the troops were to walk through them? They'd enter the displacement field. It was fine to have a wall or a floor in your displacement field. A wall or a floor couldn't see you, but an authority trooper most certainly would once inside. "Crunch," he said. "We're going to have to move out of the way." "Where?" Balta whispered. "What about the wall?" Susie asked. She, like Petrick, stuck her hand out, and it passed into the wall without any effort. "Great idea, Susie," Petrick nodded. The rest of the group shuffled to start moving. "Halt!" Haber whispered. Everyone froze. "Slowly." He pointed down at Petrick's foot, which everyone now saw had started to disappear down into the floor. "If I may, young master, I assume you've set up a static charge at the bottom of the field?" Petrick nodded in affirmative. "Then that static charge is keeping us from falling through the floor. Moving makes it weak, so I'd suggest we move very, very carefully." "We don't have time." Balta was pointing down the hallway at the troops, which were now mere feet away. "Haber's right," Petrick insisted. "If we fall through even part way, I can't phase us back without cutting our bodies in half." "Move," Susie said, and she skittered her light frame into the hall and was gone. Petrick gasped, hoping to the stars that she was okay, that the field was holding beneath her, and then he nodded to the rest of the group. They plunged into the wall as carefully as they could, just as the troops began to sweep past where they'd been squatting a second before. Behind the wall, it was dark. Because of the atomizer field, bits and pieces of the corridor beyond could still be seen. Petrick realized that if he moved the atomizer itself slightly, he could adjust the field to see, but he didn't dare move it too much, lest it uncover one of his friends, phasing them back into reality in the middle of a solid wall. As it was, he had a sliver, which he positioned just in time to see a slouched, wicked-looking man walk into view. He recognized him instantly as the thin man from the transmission when the capital ship had first arrived. The Vice, he'd called himself. He had a small figure in tow behind him, connected by a thin cord. "We've been looking for you!" another voice called, stopping the stooped man and his companion right in Petrick's view. It was Heck. Petrick could tell from the voice, and a second later the suspicion was confirmed when he also stepped into view, in front of the Vice Purveyor. "Where are the children?" the Vice Purveyor asked. His voice was raspy. It gave Petrick the shivers. "We had them until your troops stormed the marketplace, Vice Purveyor Slink," Heck said. Slink's, that was his name, title with a snarl. "I knew it," a voice breathed. Let me read that again. "I knew it," a voice breathed quietly next to Petrick's ear. It was Balta. "Slimy bastard." Petrick didn't dare respond. "You'd reported to the general you were going to intercept and capture them before they got as far as the marketplace." We were, Heck's bravado slipped somewhat, but they surprised me. Slink took a small but intentional step toward Heck, and his eyes narrowed into slits. Such incompetence is not optimal, he said. Heck started to visibly sweat. We just missed them, he gulped. They ran in here just moments ago. I saw them. We've come down this corridor, Slink said back. You're mistaken. And useless. He looked Heck in the face, then glanced down at a small device he had strapped to his wrist. He tapped some commands into the odd interface there. A moment later, he looked up. Take him into custody, Weirs, he commanded to a lagging trooper. Before Heck could protest or run, the soldier named Weirs had shoved him out of Petrick's view, and they could hear Heck kicking and screaming down the corridor toward the marketplace. You promised me immunity, Heck called back to Slink, who was watching him recede, expression unchanged. The Master Purveyor requires your services, Slink called back to him. All of you. Behind Petrick, Balta let out a noise of frustration or horror. Slink snapped his gaze toward them instantly. Petrick sucked in a breath and didn't move. Slink stared at the wall, the blank, empty wall, hard. He'd heard them. That's the end of chapter 37. Let me take a quick sip here. Make sure that everything's still working. Looks like it is. Yep, okay, awesome. Chapter 38. Slink stepped forward. His eyes were narrow, alert. Petrick resisted with all his might Petrick resisted with all his might the urge to take a step back, deeper into the wall, but he didn't dare. Again, the slouched man looked down at his wrist device and tapped some commands into it. Apparently, it didn't show him what he wanted, because he gave it a shake. He grabbed the thin cord running from the base of his head to the small companion figure and cracked it like a whip. The smaller figure groaned in pain. Slink, who'd never taken his eyes off the wrist device, cursed in frustration. Sir? A lingering soldier said. Slink stared at the device for a moment longer and then turned to look back at his guard. Stay close, Commander, he said. I'm not sure my new companion is operating very well. The guard nodded, and the two of them swept out of view. Petrick waited for what seemed like forever until the corridor was absolutely silent before he finally let out a breath he'd sucked in. Very, very slowly, Petrick called quietly into the darkness, hoping everyone was still back there, in the field, and hearing his voice. Move toward my voice, one step at a time. Petrick went out first, feeling a slight tingle on his feet as he stepped forward. Haber had been spot on. He'd formed the phase field like a dome, with the flat bottom corresponding to the floor. They had all been huddled within the dome, more or less in the middle of the field's base, and that flat bottom had stood between them and falling through the floor. As long as the field was working and they were inside it, they were just fine. Were the field to fail at the bottom, they'd fall right through. The tingly feeling meant it was weak, but it was there. Had it been strong enough? Petrick was out in the corridor a few careful steps later, and he turned to see Balta right behind him, and then Barry. Haber was next, with Clark in hand, and then finally Susie crept out. They were all there. Everyone's feet were sizzling on the floor of the field where they were supposed to be. Petrick sighed in relief. He switched off the field and felt the cold reassurance of the corridor floor flood sensation into his feet. He looked down the hallway left and right and saw that they were alone. You did it, boy! Balta clapped Petrick on the back. The motion was quickly followed by another smacking sound, this time to Balta's shoulder. Balta spun and found herself faced with a red-faced Susie. What was that for? You need to learn to keep your gob shut, she said, and pointed down the hall at where the authority contingent had moved on to. He heard you. Susie was right, but they didn't have time to argue about it. Let's move, guys, Petrick reminded them. Haber had his head cocked back in that direction, listening with his super android hearing. I suspect it will not take them much time to conclude we're not in the market. They hustled back to the window and paused there as Balta once again rummaged in her large overcoat. What are you doing? Susie pressed her. Just hold on, she said, and she produced a small cylinder that Petrick instantly recognized as similar to the one Heck had been holding and speaking into before the authority arrived. Hey, Petrick said, you're not calling the authority too? Balta swatted his protest away. Calm down, kid. Stars, she said. Not all transmitters call the authority. Petrick flushed and felt a bit foolish. Petrick keyed a particular sequence into the small transmitter, and it beeped in dutiful response. Petrick nodded and strained to look out the window, appearing to be searching for something. May I inquire as to who you are calling? Haber asked. Our ticket off this quagmire, Balta answered. She flinched as there was a flash of light outside. A second later there was an explosion that rumbled the deck and the walls around them. Guys, Barry chimed in, we need to get out of here. Keep your pants on and we might be able to do just that, Balta said. She shook her small transmitter and repeated the sequence. Beep, beep, beep. Barry couldn't just stand still, and he pressed his face up against the window to join the pirate captain in searching the outside. What are you looking for? He asked. The Red Robert, Balta answered. She shook the small cylinder in her hand. This is a comlink with Colossus. I'm hoping that since we're at the very outer wall, he'll get the transmission to take off. Take off? Haber said, rising worry in his voice. Well, then, how are we going to get on board? Listen, android, she said. We know this place is crawling with the authority both that way, she pointed ahead to the curving corridor from which Slink and his troops had come, and that way, she pointed back down the long straight corridor to the marketplace. So, our only option is to go back that way. She was pointing to the maze of corridors that led back toward the tram platform on the other side of the station, the side that faced the outer rim, away from the authority ship. If that metal lug is smart, Balta said with one last attempt at the transmitter, he's already taken off, and he's using... A bright orange and yellow explosion lit up the window, this time much closer, and the station rocked in response, nearly knocking everyone to the ground. He's using that Tusian battleship as cover to slip through to the other side. I'm afraid that we need to leave immediately, Haber said, and he pointed down the corridor leading to the marketplace. Several figures had emerged from the opening, and in front of them, bright, sharp green lines were sweeping methodically over the walls and floor. Scanners, the android explained. Balta cursed and shoved the transmitter into her overcoat and started off into the corridors leading back to the other side. Did Colossus get your message? Petrick asked, running to catch up. He hadn't heard any sort of response from the comlink. We'd better hope so, Balta said back. I told him to meet us on the far side. There's a series of airlocks that correspond to each of the transit stations. Colossus docks at one of them. We run on board, blast out of here lickety-split. Lickety-split, Petrick repeated. He certainly hoped that's how it would go down. Oh, crunch, Barry said what everyone was thinking as their group huddled behind a set of abandoned cargo bins that smelled like grease and wet hair. Why don't they move already? He was pointing to the 4 men dead ahead of them, who were milling about the airlock, but not actually going anywhere. They were the same 4 tall men they'd seen back in the corridors, running ahead of the authority troops. The whole group was itching with urgency. Balta had gotten them all lost, again, leading them back to the tram station area. Haber's step tracking had been able to bail them out, thank stars. But now they were at a standstill. Time was ticking away. There was no chance of trying to get past the men to the airlock that was a tantalizing 30 feet beyond them. The 4 men stood watching the chaos unfolding outside the nearest viewport. From the almost constant rumblings now and blinding flashes of light, things were hot and dangerous out there. They must be waiting for a ship, just like us, Petrick whispered. Difference is, we don't even know if our ship is coming, Barry mourned in a huff. Colossus will be out there, Balta replied, sounding very sure of herself. This isn't the first time we'll have slipped past the authority. I think it would be wise to focus on the issue in front of us, Haber interjected, pointing at the group pacing back and forth outside their intended means of escape. The 4 men were better lit now, and Balta identified them as Lanesh traders. She said they'd once been the primary go-betweens among the prosperous worlds of the Inner Rim. Their fleets had been thousands strong, and they were extremely wealthy and well-cultured. They'd been at the center of a Renaissance age of travel, trade, art, and knowledge. Looking at these 4 young men, that was certainly hard to believe. Their once brilliantly multicolored clothes were faded and threadbare, and they clearly hadn't bathed in days, perhaps weeks. Balta said these days they traded in illicit goods, things their forebears would never have dreamed touching, like black tar, impure starstuff that was dangerous in the most desperate of situations, or even humans. Balta said Heck might have tried to sell Susie to the Lanesh, before he realized the authority was after them, anyway. It's no use letting them see us, Balta said. They'd turn around and sell us to the authority in a microsecond. Maybe Clark can distract them, Barry suggested. Petrick squeezed Clark closer to his body. The fluffball was exhausted, as was Petrick himself, he realized. But now was no time to think about such things. And then what? Petrick said to Barry. We don't have anything to overpower them. We have Haber, Susie said. He's strong enough. While I appreciate the vote of confidence, young mistress, Haber said, I doubt I could single-handedly subdue 4 young men at the peak of their physical prowess. I wouldn't say those skinny traders are at the peak of their physical prowess, Sorry, let me read that again. I wouldn't say those skinny traders are at the peak of their physical prowess, Balta grunted. But you're still right. Even with my pistols. She patted her coat pockets, where she kept her 2 golden guns. Too many of 'em, and too many places to hide and dig in or call for the authority. Well, then we're cooked, aren't we? Barry said with a harumph. We'll just sit here until the authority shows up anyway. Everyone sighed, Susie the loudest. It was the sound she made when Barry said something that actually made sense. And made sense he had. They couldn't just sit here. If the Red Robert was out there, waiting, every minute that went by was another the ship could be discovered and captured. Any word from Colossus? Petrick asked for what must have been the billionth time. We're back out to the edge now. Maybe it's working. Balta shook her head. It wasn't. It seems we have no other choice, Haber said. We must attempt to overpower those 4 young men. Susie picked up a jagged piece of broken plastic from one of the bins in front of them and gave it a swing. It'll be just like fighting Litz and the bullies back home, she said. I don't know why you're so excited, Barry said. Sorry. Let me read that again. I don't know why you're so excited, Barry said to her. Last time we ran into Litz and his bullies, I seem to remember we all got squashed. Back then, we didn't have Haber and Balta, Susie replied. We can do it. Children, I want you to... Haber's words were cut off by the sound of a clank in the direction of the airlock. Everybody froze, including the 4 men being watched. Then, one of them peered out the window and motioned back to his compatriots in affirmation. Petrick could barely see out the window, but the sliver that was visible was unmistakable. A ship had just docked with the airlock, and the men were running toward it to board. Do you think that's the Red Robert? Petrick asked, daring to poke his head above the crates to get a better look. I don't think so, Balta answered, warily doing the same. They needn't have been so cautious. The 4 men never looked back as they poured themselves into the airlock and shut the large door behind them. With the metallic thud of the door latching, our group's most immediate obstacle was gone. They stepped out from behind their cover and looked at Balta as if to say, what now? Balta answered them by taking her comlink and switching it back on. She didn't have time to do anything with it, however, because a microsecond later, everything exploded. And that's the end of chapter 38. All right, you guys. Hopefully everything went well with the stream. But we'll pick up same time, same place tomorrow with chapter 39 and 40. Man, we don't have a lot left. We've got 10 chapters left to read. That's it. Uh, yeah. So thank you guys for joining me. Really, really enjoying doing this. I'm gonna be sad when the book's over. We're almost there. And you know what? I don't know if I mentioned this, but obviously we've only got that much left of the story left, and we're nowhere near finding Fenton or the source. So you might as well know if I haven't mentioned it to this point yet, but it is book one of a trilogy, and a trilogy in the very classic kind of J.R.R. Tolkien sense of it's one story told over 3 books. So just so you know, this is just book one. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me. I really, really, really appreciate you watching. Let me know if you have any questions that I can answer for you. I'd be happy to. And let's do this same time, same place tomorrow. And we'll pick right up. We'll find out what's going on with this whole explosion thing. What's going on. I will see you tomorrow.